Welcome to the Consumer Finance Podcast. I'm Chris Willis, the co-leader of Troutman Pepper Locke's Consumer Financial Services Regulatory Practice. And today we're going to be talking about an area of high interest to our financial services companies, and that's ways to use restructuring to optimize assets and to try to avoid liabilities from polluting the rest of a company. But before we jump into that topic, let me remind you to visit and subscribe to our blogs, troutmanfinancialservices.com and consumerfinancialserviceslawmonitor.com. And don't forget to check out all of our other podcasts, the FCRA Focus, the Crypto Exchange, Unauthorized Access, which is our privacy and data security podcast, Payments Pros, and Moving the Metal, which is our auto finance podcast. All of those are available on all popular podcast platforms. And speaking of those platforms, if you like this podcast, let us know. Leave us a review on your platform of choice and tell us how we're doing. Now, as I said, today we're going to be talking about corporate restructuring. And this is an example of one of the things that I love most about Troutman Pepper Locke and love most about the podcast is that we have such a broad practice that can serve all of the needs of our financial services clients, not just the consumer financial services regulatory and litigation work that you may know us for, but also all kinds of other things, including corporate and restructuring work. And to talk to us about that today is my partner, Alex Rovira. Alex is a partner in our Bankruptcy and Restructuring group. He's in our New York office, and I'm really glad that he's here to talk with you today. So Alex, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks. Happy to be here. Looking forward to it.
So Alex, let's set the stage here. Why would this be a topic of interest to our financial services company clients?
In this kind of market, there is a lot of distress and liability where there is consumer-facing businesses, and particularly businesses that provide financing or that providing financing to consumers. And so these types of restructurings help to alleviate or address where there is liability facing businesses. And the focus that I wanted to do here is to talk about two recent trends that we see in consumer facing business or in companies like private equity where they've purchased different businesses and for whatever reason, whether it's a regulatory or a business impediment or an unsuspected liability that arises in a particular business or asset, these are two methods of restructurings that allow you to isolate those liabilities and be able to manage them in a more efficient way when those liabilities do arise. Or if they do not arise, also to help provide for a stronger credit base so that you can finance and get new financing on the stronger lines of businesses.
Yeah, and so a couple of real world examples of that I can think of is number one, portfolio performance. You may have a consumer finance company who has a portfolio of loans that's not performing according to expectations. We actually see this in the market all the time as clients are buying or selling portfolios or buying or selling companies. And so that's one example where you have a business liability that's subject to this kind of restructuring. And the other one has to do with a regulatory action. You do have certain more innovative financial products that might even be the subject of investment by outsiders, including private equity firms. And then you might have a regulator come in and interfere with the business model by taking a regulatory enforcement position or even having the state legislature pass a statute that really calls into question the underlying company's business model. And that's the kind of unexpected liability or corporate development, Alex, that I think you were talking about, right?
That's right. And you don't want that line of business to affect a completely different line of business that you may have solely because they're sharing different facilities or because they're in the same kind of parent structure.
Okay. So there's two types of transactions that I think you've been seeing companies in the market doing recently. Can you just introduce those to the audience?
Yeah, so these types of transactions are called, the first is an optimization restructuring. And that really looks to restructure where a company is looking to restructure internally to align its business and assets in a way that maximizes value and ring fences liabilities. The second is a financial balance sheet liability management exercise. And that really looks at the debt documents and to see whether there's ability to create additional pockets of value that can be used to finance and provide additional liquidity or to pay off and exchange certain liabilities.
Okay, thanks. So let's talk about the optimization restructurings first. What are some of the benefits of these kinds of transaction and who's doing them?
Yeah, so this is applicable to kind of any business. And historically, it's been done where there's a significant liability that's known or that is foreseen, particularly around litigation. But we've seen more and more of this arise where there's structurally, and particularly in the kind of private equity context, there's a mixed match of different businesses that a private equity has invested in and hasn't structured it appropriately. So you see it in the context of kind of private equity more and more. And then you see it in any business where there is a liability that's starting to increase or distress that's starting to become prevalent in the market. So you see it where there's increased consumer credit defaults. And so we're seeing that rise over the last couple of years. And that's where consumer-facing businesses are starting to see how should we position ourselves where there's a particular asset that has more risk and liability to it, where these other pools of assets do not share that same kind of risk profile.
Sure. So you've got one loan program that's performing poorly and the others are performing okay.
Right.
And that would be a call or a trigger for this kind of restructuring that we're about to talk about, right?
Right. And the benefits, to your second question, was the benefits of this is it limits that risk to that line of business, to that ring fence business, so that it doesn't affect and cause the entire business valuation or business enterprise to suffer where there's a particular liability that's causing the distress. The second is it actually allows you to create stronger credit lines in terms of business lines will be able to get more financing in stronger terms where they don't have that same risk profile. And then the last is when you are able to optimize structurally your kind of corporate entities, it does allow for if there's a potential to sell some of those assets, whether it's the risky liability one where you want to sell that off without affecting the other entities, or if you want to sell off a healthy side of the business. So it serves a lot of different purposes. And the main one is to kind of isolate the liability, but it does provide these side benefits as well.
Yeah, and all of those sound like very clear, good, real world use cases for what we're talking about. So if you don't mind, let's broadly talk through a roadmap of how these transactions and restructurings are actually accomplished. Can you tell us?
Yeah, so the optimization one is really kind of a separation and alignment of your corporate group, and particularly done around business lines or segments of your businesses or asset pools to enhance the value of the good asset pool versus those that are facing more of risk or liability. And so these strategic opportunities are creating optionality to deal with those liabilities or those, let's say, bad assets with optionality of better finance or sale on the good assets. And so that is more of, again, a structural optimization and gives optionality to management and to the board on having to deal with those. And so the goals and objectives of those are really to isolate entities and assets subject to those current and potentially future claims and liabilities. It also helps to provide asset and cash flow to address current and future liabilities of those entities. So if you think about putting a pool of assets under a certain business line, you want to make sure and maintain that there is asset value there to be able to deal with that liability, but not having the good business lines kind of have to cover that type of liability. So it's really kind of just aligning the risk profile of different asset pools, but it could also be done aligning different business line segments. And so this really gives the company, the management, the optionality for future growth. It enhances strategic options, including acquisitions into certain business lines, having that facility and a place ready for that, and allowing for stronger credit to either do potential purchases or to do divestitures or sales of good or bad assets. So it's really just a way of aligning your business lines and assets in a way that really provides the optionality to deal with those liabilities and to grow and have better financing available to your other business lines.
That makes a lot of sense. So let's talk about the other type of restructuring that you mentioned at the top of the show, which is the liability management transactions. You said you've seen companies engaging in these as well. How do they differ from the optimization restructuring that you just described?
Yeah, so the optimization is really kind of a corporate structure and internal structuring process. The liability management exercise are really focused on the balance sheet financial restructuring. And this is through looking at the current debt facilities and seeing where there is potential and opportunities to create additional pockets of financing And so you're looking really more at a balance sheet restructuring of the business rather than a structural reorganization and ring fencing of the business. The objective of the liability management exercise is really on the balance sheet. It's to provide additional liquidity. It's to deleverage the business by getting that additional liquidity to pay off some of your former liability. And it comes in different ways. There's mainly two different varieties. There's an asset drop down or there's a up-tiering transaction. There are other types as well, but those are the main two. One is, again, the asset drop down, and the second is the up-tiering priming transactions. When you're in a challenged market and facing distress, it's often hard to get new credit terms. And so particularly where there are already existing lenders. And this is where it becomes looking at your existing lenders and determining whether there's a group of those lenders that are willing to provide some financing. And so this has early days of this was called creditor on creditor violence because you had particular creditors, lenders seeking to provide additional financing to the harm of other lenders in that lender group. But more and more so now, because there has been litigation, these lenders are looking and allowing most of the existing lenders to participate, but maybe on different economic terms. So those are kind of the liability management exercises and how they differ from the structural optimization exercises.
Well, let's get into the weeds even a little bit further because I'm really learning a lot here. Talk to me about the two types of transactions you mentioned. Let's start with the asset dropdowns. How does that work?
The asset dropdowns really involves the transfer of assets to a non-loan party subsidiary or an unrestricted subsidiary. That's a subsidiary that is not within the restricted subsidiaries in the existing loan facility. And so what that asset drop down looks to do is looks at the baskets of availability and the covenants of that financing and to allow for assets to be able to drop down into another subsidiary within those permitted covenants and then to provide additional financing to that unrestricted subsidiary. And that unrestricted subsidiary then structurally subordinates the prior existing lenders to the assets that new created subsidiary. So while the assets are transferred and they may have been secured for the existing credit facilities, those are now released. Those liens on those assets are now released and transferred to a subsidiary that's outside of that credit structure and is able to be used as new collateral for the new financing. And that's where the new lenders come in and have direct claims to those assets. And they would have priority to and that structural subordination I mentioned to you with respect to those assets over and ahead of the existing lenders. So it's a great tool. It's been tightening up a little bit, but the real key of it and the benefit of it is that you can do this without consent of the current existing creditors because there's availability in the documents to be able to put together enough of a basket to allow for the drop down of these assets. We initially saw this, and this might be something in more of the kind of the financial type of the tech type companies, because we initially saw this where there wasn't really value put into the IP. And so IP was the primary asset that was kind of dropped down. And now they've increased significantly in the value that IP has. And so that has allowed for the IP to be one of the main crown jewel assets to be able to create new financing.
Well, it sounds, Alex, that the real key to doing one of these asset drop downs is to take a careful look at the existing commercial loan covenants that the borrower may have to make sure that the transfer of the assets down to the new drop down subsidiary doesn't put the borrower, the existing borrower, in breach of any of those covenants, right?
That's right. And, as lawyers, there's a lot of interpretations of kind of how those covenants can be read and what's available. And so there has been litigation around what's allowed and what's not allowed, what's restricted and what's unrestricted. But there's flexibility, and the overall goal is to provide additional liquidity to the company, which will provide further runway for the company to be able to satisfy all of its liabilities. So there has been litigation around it, but it's our job to be creative and to be able to find avenues and ability for our clients to have additional liquidity.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So now I'm very eager to hear about the other type of transaction, which is the up-tiering one. Let's talk about that.
Right. So in the drop down, you we're dropping down particular assets, creating a basket of unencumbered collateral. The up-tiering one is where the existing creditors now are amending the documents because they have the ability to, under kind of the majority of required lender determinations in the document, to amend the documents in a way that allows them to have super priority over the existing creditors. So this is really has become more of the first tool out of the toolbox rather than the drop down. And it does raise additional secured debt capacity by creating this new class that has that super priority. Now, the real key to this one is that you have to have the required lenders, whether that's a majority or a supermajority, to be able to amend the borrower's debt documents to permit that additional incurrence of super priority debt. And sometimes what that new debt does is it may strip away some of the rights and benefits that the existing lenders had. And so you really want to, from the lender side, you really want to be able to be in that majority of that required lenders. Because if you're not, then you would be subordinated to and be second in priority where you thought you had overall priority. And so it's important from the lender side to determine kind of where you sit in that stack of control. But it's very helpful for a borrower because the borrower is able to work with its lender group to be able to amend documents and to create this additional liquidity. The other thing that this does is that bringing in that liquidity allows you to kind of deleverage or extend the existing majorities. And so when you're amending the documents with this supermajority or just a majority required lenders, it does allow you to amend different parts of the document. And so you could extend maturities on the existing debts. You can reduce their collateral package that they come and put them into a second place position. So it's a very powerful tool. It does create, again, that creditor on creditor violence that we've started to see. And so that really comes down to, will all lenders be able to participate in that? And the initial first of these transactions, it really was the ad hoc group that had the majority in that control position, the required lenders position, that were driving this and did not provide opportunity to all creditors. And so those creditors that were left behind did not have the opportunity to participate or to consent. And that's where the litigation started to arise around these types of transactions. And as a reaction to that, there's been a couple of different flavors. Some lenders have now entered into cooperation agreements where they'll agree to work together and doing an up-tier transaction. And other structures have found that they try to now allow all lenders to participate, but that required majority is having better economics on it. So they're kind of tiering because they were the ones that drove the process, put together the financing, and then went to the company with this structure. They're getting a little bit of better economics. And while that's still harmful to the existing lenders that are not in that favored group, it's still beneficial for them to get some economics rather than go through down a route of litigation. So that's the flavor that we're seeing a little bit more of now.
That is all really fascinating, Alex. And these are things that it's very educational to me, and I hope to our audience as well, because it really shows some of the flexibility and experience that our restructuring and bankruptcy group, which you're in, has to offer clients in these variety of circumstances, whether they're the ones facing the liability or they own one facing the liability, or whether they're a creditor of one on a commercial basis that's facing a liability like that. And so I'm really glad that you were able to be on the show today to talk to our clients about one of the many facets of services our firm can provide to financial services companies. And of course, thanks to our audience for listening to today's episode as well. Don't forget to visit and subscribe to our blogs, troutmanfinancialservices.com and consumerfinancialserviceslawmonitor.com. And while you're at it, why not visit us on the web at troutman.com and add yourself to our Consumer Financial Services email list. That way we can send you copies of the alerts and advisories that we release from time to time, as well as invitations to our industry-only webinars. And of course, stay tuned for a great new episode of this podcast every Thursday afternoon. Thank you all for listening.
Copyright Troutman Pepperlock, LLP. These recorded materials are designed for educational purposes only. This podcast is not legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual participants. Troutman does not make any representations or warranties, expressed or implied, regarding the contents of this podcast. Information on previous case results does not guarantee a similar future result. Users of this podcast may save and use the podcast only for personal or other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without the prior written permission of Troutman Pepper Locke. If you have any questions, please contact us at troutman.com.